welcome to Roses All Trash, the sister podcast to Read Community, an international community with members in at least 13 countries. This month's calendar is titled Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. This is our second episode of the month, The Captive Maternal, Black Women, and Decolonization.
Our first reading is by Dr. Sabrina Strings from her book Fearing the Black Body. This is the section titled Thinness as American Exceptionalism. Dr. Strings discusses the origins of fat phobia and in America specifically, and the creation of this ideal American beauty and this ideal American woman as this thin, white, tall, lean Nordic woman as intrinsically tied to the development of eugenics and the fear of immigrants in America, specifically in the 1800s. She talks about the influx of Americans, first Irish and then Eastern European, specifically Jewish people, like Russian Jewish people, and the fear and hatred around these immigrants and the labeling of them as fat, lazy, and ugly, and being tied to the creation of eugenics. And this creation is often done by the same people who are pioneering this, the scientific race theory, aka eugenics, are the same people discussing how proof of white superiority is these American beauties, these tall, lean, slender, Nordic, Aryan, British-blooded women who are supposedly the model of American exceptionalism and American perfection. An example of this would be the Gibson girl, who was created by an illustrator and was sort of this idealized American woman that was popular. The Gibson girl became the absolute standard of beauty, tied to the idea of America as a melting pot of races, but only of specific races, and only the best races and the best parts of those races to form this ideal of beauty.
Whenever I hear Nordic, I think of that scene in Mad Men. It's one of my favorite scenes. So this super young guy is coming on to her. I think it's one of the last times that Betty actually feels, attractive. It's like a final ray of sun coming over during a sunset where she's it's casual enough for her to brush it off, and he says, "You look so sad, you look so profound," and she's clearly used to this kind of thing, right? But it's interesting to her, and she's like, "No, my people are just Nordic." Wow, the acting in that one sentence, I don't know, very, very relatable. The second reading is The Womb of Western Theory, Trauma, Time Theft, and the Captive Maternal by Joy James. This one was a hard one. There was just a lot of concepts in it that I wasn't familiar with. It had nothing to do with it being difficultly written. It was actually very clearly written, almost deceptively so, because I would just be reading a normal sentence and then it would invoke this concept or this figure, and I was I feel I should be able to understand this, but I can't. And I think that is definitely the point of a lot of Joy James's writing. Firstly, she starts by establishing that since colonization and imperialism, the point is to take over another nation's resources, to expand one's own influence and wealth, right? Captive maternals are, quote, those most vulnerable to violence, war, poverty, police, and captivity, those whose very existence enables the possessive empire that claims and dispossesses them. Throughout history, captive maternals provided the reproductive and productive labor to stabilize culture and wealth, end quote. So, imperialism can't exist without captive maternals, is basically what James is saying. And centuries later, now Black captive maternals remain disproportionately disciplined, denigrated, and consumed for the greater democracy. In this particular text, James spends most of the time critiquing womb theory, which is synonymous with Western theory. It's called womb theory because it has the space to grow and progress over time. From however horrible of an origin of colonization and imperialism that it started with, it's now able to adopt these progressive ideals and make room, so to speak, for humanism, feminism, anti-racism. It's this idea that it's justified because of the people within it, even though the whole system is not working, if that makes sense. The telling of history, for example, by Foucault, is somehow all about racism without being about Black people, or it's about Black suffering without being about Black history. It can even be about Blackness, but not about Black resistance, Black rebellion, Black microcommunities. These histories help us understand other histories, and yet we can't even talk about actual Black history. Black people pop up in the telling of history again and again, but they are not connected to each other. They don't create a timeline, and instead, they, as stories, have to prop up the timelines of Western history. And in her other works, James offers the Black Matrix or Afrorealism, which doesn't view even concepts like democracy or progressivism or humanism or feminism as isolated things, but rather as concepts that occurred right alongside continued subjugation of people, especially Black people.
Right. And the final reading is Overcoming White Supremacy by Bell Hooks. This reading discusses the ways in which white liberals have sort of become reactionary and become complicit in the upholding of white supremacy through their inability to acknowledge their role in the structure of white supremacy. And it differentiates white supremacy and racism because racism is viewed as like this active choice, this like specifically actively held prejudice that someone has, whereas white supremacy is this very passive, sort of unnoticeable, like water underneath it all. That's kind of been the sinkhole that has prevented us from achieving like real racial equality. Specifically, white liberals are unable to understand that they are also a key player in white supremacy because they don't want to acknowledge the fact that they contribute to it by not being active destroyers of it. Bell Hooks also discusses the way certain movements like the Black Power movement, like Black is Beautiful movement, were eventually sort of became unfashionable because they were too closely associated with like militarization and like these sort of extreme, more radical or groups of people. And they were replaced with this type of sort of assimilation or respectability politics as like kind of a means to an end in order to survive white supremacy, attempt to achieve racial equality by conforming to the white ideal, but how that's really just enforced the whiteness as ideal instead of achieving any real social change.
Yeah, what I think is really interesting is that when I read the Hooks reading for the first time, her influences, specifically Gramsci, are like explicitly criticized by other decolonialization scholars, because it's this idea that like you have to liberate your own mind first and sort of teaching decolonization. And interestingly, I think James would also, because she has a historian's perspective or philosophy of history perspective, a historiographical perspective, she would say that that sort of like assimilated decolonization still counts because she's not about this is the wrong way to decolonize, this is the right way to decolonize, but she's saying that it is happening. Also, something that we should mention is that in James's text, she quotes and speaks about Virginia Woolf, whose Mrs. Dalloway is the source of the title of this podcast, which we've never talked about on this podcast. The title is Roses All Trash, and it comes from a scene where there's this one-off character. There's a lot of one-off characters in Mrs. Dalloway that we get a look into their thinking and their minds and even their history, like right in the moment, but we never see them again in the book. It's all about this, like, ephemerality. That's a big theme in Mrs. Dalloway. And so Roses All Trash comes from when we look into the mind of this sort of older woman who's watching a younger woman. She knows who she is, but they're not familiar with each other. And she sort of looks at her and she can't help smiling, but she also is forced to remind herself. She says, "Roses, all trash, my dear," in her head, because she's comparing that younger woman's youth and joy and freedom to a flower that is nothing. It is made nothing by marriage. And it's very casual. It's a very casual thought. But obviously, because she's a one-off character, it's very pointed. You know, we don't get many of her thoughts, and that's one of them. This compulsive thought about how marriage steals joy. And I thought that was interesting because it was a little unself-aware of Woolf, as discussed in James's text here. Woolf is compared to another female poet, Phillis Wheatley. But Phillis Wheatley was enslaved and benevolently educated, and she was Black. She had a type of assimilative politics in her writing. There was a pragmatism behind her writing, at least as James and some other scholars analyze it. Wheatley did get commended by George Washington, who had an estate of $350 million, all based on the work of slaves, right? And yet, one of Woolf's most inspiring works that I know you're a fan of, Catherine, is A Room of One's Own. We've also spoken about A Room of One's Own on the podcast. James quotes from that book, "There is no gate, no lock, no bolt that you can set upon the freedom of my mind." And she says about Woolf, "Woolf has the political agency to withhold praise from her would-be handlers because she is female, not slave. Not needing the endorsements of presidents, she condemns her subjugation and servitude, perhaps while being served tea."
Bell Hooks also discusses the idea of like of assimilation and like respectability politics as a means to an end, just to survive inside, kind of similar to complying with like fat phobia, to just try to avoid to be punished rather than to radically attempt to abolish the system. It's important that we have to survive on a day-to-day basis in this world. So like what's the balance between a means to an end and radical change that we can strike to ensure the like safety and health of the people who are attempting to achieve this change?
Well, I think the respectability politics point is actually really salient because when I did polls on my Instagram a while ago and I said, is it okay or not okay to exercise just to be thin? Like a huge majority of people said yes. And I was like, how is that possible when we don't think being fat is bad? You know?
Mm-hmm.
Like thinking about maybe my fat friends who would have said it's okay to exercise to be thin, that makes sense, right? Like that's okay, question mark, because that's more about this assimilative pressure, whereas like my thin friends upholding it, I know that that kind of, it sounds like virtue signaling, but it's not, because who you are and what body you inhabit and how you've grown up actually does matter. So like yes, I think fat people can be like, yeah, but I want to be skinny, like in very sort of very crude terms. Like it does matter who you are.
Yeah. We talked earlier about like thinness and like fat phobia and stuff and like how pervasive it is and how like you really are so rewarded for adhering to that standard. Like the reward is high. I mean, granted, it's not like you're not given true freedom or liberation by achieving that standard of beauty. Obviously, like it's a different type of constraint, but you're still overall rewarded for it and treated in such a different light. So like you can't, like I kind of can't blame people for wanting to achieve that reward or wanting to move themselves closer to that standard.
Well, I think what does make me like still fall on the side of like I want to hold them personally accountable. As in like I don't want to be friends with people like that. I don't want to be friends with like people who like throw their hands up and they're like, well, I'm rewarded for it, so how am I supposed to resist? Is because it's not just that you're rewarded for being thin, but punishment is withheld from you, if that makes sense. Like it's not just that you get a treat, but it's that you don't get hit, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, you don't get verbally abused on the street.
Exactly.
Or you get verbally abused, but in a different way. Yeah, I understand what you mean. Also, like not wanting friends who are like still in that mindset of like, oh, but it's rewarding me. Because like I totally understand that mindset, but I also agree with you that like I don't, like I actively try to avoid spending time with people like that. You know, it's like I empathize with the pain that they're feeling with wanting to avoid the punishment and like with wanting to just do whatever it takes to not be punished that way. But it's also like I'm trying to get out too. You know.
I don't know. Sometimes I've been wondering this a lot. Like where exactly do I draw the line? Like in terms of like people who are kind of struggling to be liberated. Do I real Are my friends actually liberated, or are they just my friends and that's why I think they're liberated? You know what I mean?
I mean, I don't know. I feel like to be fully liberated obviously is like a bit of a high bar to ask. I just ask
I
that like
mean,
they're
yeah, not
working towards it.
materially liberated, I guess, but intellectually liberated.
I guess for me, the question is like, are they actually like working on themselves and like working on getting closer to that point of like liberation?
But that's what I mean. Like, there are lots of people who are working on themselves, but when I meet them, I'm like, I don't want to be friends with this person. But like, I'm sure my friends are perfect. Like, that's impossible. I'm sure that like I'm not perfect and I'm not perfectly liberated. And yet I'm like, no, 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 my friend's different. No, 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 like we are though.
Yeah. I mean, that's also like similar, like we talked about last episode, we talked about like how people tend to end up in like racially segregated groups or like friend groups often form around race. And how like when I see like a friend group that's like entirely like people of color or like entirely black people, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, you know, they probably feel like safer and like more at ease with one another than with white people there in their space, you know? Whereas like if you see a group that's like entirely white, it's like, you know, it's kind of like that dynamic. Like if people of color or if like any marginalized group is like, I only want to hang out with other people in my marginalized group, I'm like, yeah, that totally makes sense. Like, you know, of course, like obviously, whereas like when the oppressor is like, we're only going to hang out with each other, I'm like, stop that right now. Like,
No, exactly, because what is the outcome of that? It's this consolidation, this commiseration, this building of white power, basically. Like, that is the result of when white people aren't exposed to diverse culture. Like, that's what happens. And on the flip side, when people of color make connections and community through their racial background, that results in empowerment. So, like, it's very different, you know?
and back to like your original point about like larger people who want to be smaller through exercise, like, I can't blame them for that. Like, I know that the world is like really awful. Like, I can't blame them for just like, you know, doing what they need to do, like a means to an end to survive. Like, who am I to criticize their life choices?
I think that, like, fat people or black people or Asian people or whatever can, amongst each other, be like, hey, don't you think you're giving into this a little too much? So sometimes when, like, black people are pandering to white liberals or white conservatives or whatever, on social media, people will comment or just comment to each other, right? Even in person, like, oh, they're tap dancing. Because it's this idea of like, they're minstrels. They're like pandering to white people, to white politics, to white guilt, white frailty.
I think something that's interesting is like a lot of fat activists and fat authors, or like people I've seen written about their experiences, fat people have talked about how like the constant need to prove that you're healthy and how that's like a huge aspect of their daily lives now at this point, is like, you know, having to tell people like, oh, this is like my blood pressure is perfect, you know, like, you know, I've done all my tests, like always perfect. I, you know, work out all the time. Like Lizzo is, I mean, obviously I can't speak for her motivations behind what she posts, and like she's her person who can post and do whatever she pleases, but she posts a lot about being vegan, like workout videos and stuff, and it's like making sure health is this really performative thing so as to prove that you're not a bad person, or like you're not lacking in self-discipline, that it's some uncontrollable force. Because if you didn't prove that and implied that like maybe you were even choosing to be that size, then that would be like unforgivable from those around you. I remember seeing a video where like this fat activist, this like body positive fat activist, she's talking about how like how angry people get when she's like, you actually like didn't have to spend your whole life dieting. Like you didn't have to do that. Like you could have just not done that. Like imagine how different and how much better your life would have been if you just hadn't had to do that. Like you hadn't spent all those years and all that money on that. And she's like, yeah, people get really mad when I tell them that. It's an invalidation of the way that they've lived their life. Because for so many people, like even like stirred size people, they've put like all this work into maintaining that, you know, regardless of whether or not they really needed to. Like they still like put all this effort into dedicate like a huge portion of their lives into maintaining their like power or like their position of thinness, and then seeing that they didn't have to and that they could have just been happy and chill regardless is like invalidates all of that work for them.
And like, I'm thinking of how annoyed like non-fat people get, or even fat people get, when like fat people like flaunt their bodies and stuff. This person's truest way to liberate themselves is to be as loud and proud about it as possible. People who are uncomfortable with doing that themselves mistake that as a discomfort with that person doing it.
So something that struck me about the Strings reading in terms of that is a very brief overview of the like greater body of Dr. String's writings. Is she talks about how a lot of this base is based in this sort of Protestant aestheticism, this idea of denying yourself food to make yourself like a moral better person, a more like self-disciplined person. Your thinness is physical evidence that you are a good person, that you have self-control, that you're not like some animal just eating anything. And if you're fat, then like clearly it's the opposite. And so it's like based in this sort of like religious abstinence born out of the Enlightenment as well. It's a sign of like intellectual superiority. A theory that I've heard kind of loosely tossed around that I think has some merit to it is this idea that in conjunction with periods of time where women have achieved much greater social and political power, like around the time that women were able to achieve the vote, or when women were given things like equal pay or allowed to even just hold bank accounts and like, different waves of feminism, those coincide with periods of time where the beauty ideal became significantly thinner. And there's this idea of the internalized corset and this work and this extra burden placed upon women to achieve that ideal. Superior races are supposed to be morally and mentally superior and therefore prove that through their thinness more than just like, oh, they're just genetically thin. And that's part of the value placed on them.
It's also like that work isn't just, individual actions or individual thoughts, right? It accumulates into this framework that they have, like, that cannot be challenged because it's painful. Like, it's literally neurologically painful to have these core frameworks challenged. And so you end up fitting everything and anything into your framework just to make it less painful. That's real, but they don't deserve to be coddled by people who are like liberated by flaunting it and stuff. Like, they're not beholden to be nice and be like, oh yeah, I used to feel that way, but now I feel this way. Like, they don't have to coach you through it, because just because like you share the same identity marker doesn't mean that like you're family or that you're even you're even community.
Yeah, that ties in really nicely with like the bell hooks piece that we wrote because like it's a framework that we have in our head and we will like bend over backwards to make the information that we're given fit into this framework rather than challenge the framework itself because like you said it's painful and like world shattering to try to challenge that pain work or that framework pain work.
That's
And
beautiful.
that's one of the reasons that's one of the reasons bell hooks says that like white liberals specifically have such a hard time understanding their role in white supremacy, like understanding that they're not doing enough because they see it as a action that you consciously choose to make rather than a framework that alters and distorts your view of the world like every second of every day. Or bell hooks writes, rejecting the work that is of healing and confronting white supremacy does not mean that we cannot or do not show the way by our actions, by the information that we share. I think that was really poignant in that like it's not her responsibility to teach like white people how to be better people, but like through living her more liberated self, like she can lead the way through her actions.
Oh, and not to minimize white people's pain or whatever, but like that same thought process was literally going on when in the 16, 17, 1800s when they decided to make slavery like forever a thing. It's that people could see what they were doing to black people. Were in the only way to make that work, the only way to get rid of that pain, of that white pain, was to be like, well, black people aren't people. So it's like, and that leads directly into what an incredibly round conversation, not by our benefit, but by black historians and black scholars, that leads right into eugenics. That's why all of this freaking science came out that had nothing to do with Darwinism, came out to show that black people aren't people. Actually, Asian people aren't people either. Actually, we're all different, but like white people are the ideal. And that was written by these white scholars. They straight up, no shame whatsoever, were like, it seems that white people are the ideal. Like, no one is as tall or whatever. Like, that's not even true. There's so many tall black people. Like, there's so many tall Northern Korean people. Not North Korea, but like in the north.
These eugenic scientists were like, okay, so for centuries we've put like black people at a disadvantaged position in our society and like we've enslaved them and given them no money and we have been awful in an unfathomable way. And now they're not thriving or succeeding the same way white people are. It must be their fault. Like,
They must be stupid. They must be animals. Like,
then like this is absolutely no
I
relation to the
know there
circumstances
was
we
the
put them
concept
in.
of, yeah, I know there was the concept of peer reviewing before this. Like, where is the peer reviewing? Like,
The scientific process, like, did you not control all the other variables? Like, how
exactly.
can this ever be a realistic study?
And that's how, like, real these frameworks are. That's how a real racism is ingrained in people's literal, like, psychological mental infrastructures.
There is a quote, Islin describes thinness as a form of American exceptionalism. It is a type of beauty possible only in the United States, where the best of all races, those from Northern and Western Europe, had arrived as immigrants. Tessie, quote, desirable immigrants had mixed and mingled to produce progeny who were tall, thin, and of unsurpassed beauty. The language of natural selection is certainly Galtonian, showing Gibson to be Charles Gibson, who drew the Gibson girl, to be conversant with eugenic ideologies. Moreover, his description was indicative of the prevailing racial logic of Northern European superiority. For although he suggests that America is exceptional because it is a melting pot of the races, he does not mention all the races in the brew, preferring to name instead only the ones he finds most important. The best part of her quote, the best part of her beauty will and has come from the nation of our origin, Great Britain. I don't know what else to say. I feel like that sums it up so succinctly. Obviously, I want to preface this by saying that, like, clearly I know racism is real and incredibly, like, violent and exists, you know? And same thing with, like, misogyny. Like, obviously, I'm aware it exists, I experience it. But it's one of those things where every now and then, like, you kind of, like, realize just the true absurdity of it. Like, not to minimize at all depth of how evil it is, but, like, sometimes I just think, I'm like, man, we really said, like, 50% of the population lesser, just arbitrarily based on a physical characteristic. We were like, yeah, they don't deserve rights. Like, obviously it wasn't like that, you know, a single decision, but, like, just sometimes like that, it's so crazy that people actually think that, you know? I mean, like, obviously they do. Like, I know I've internalized that. Like, I know it's, you know, but sometimes I'm like, well, that's just insane. Would you, like, take a step back? You know, like, this is just the most absurd, arbitrary system of power. It's like literally, sometimes I think about those children books where, like, everyone has this circle on their chest, but then one guy has a square. He gets
Yeah,
ostracized. Then we find out that whether or not you have a circle or a square, you're still you know, like something. I'm like, damn, it really is like that. I mean, obviously,
it's not, but
unfathomably much more violent. And again, I don't mean to minimize it in any way.
and I think I can definitely see a lot of people like actually disagreeing with us, saying that it's actually not that simple at all. I think James could be one of them. Her concept of Afrorealism is like, okay, black people were everywhere in history. So why isn't history about black people? You know, like it seems so simple, but that would really change everything. Like
Yeah,
the history being written by the victors, whatever, so cliche. And honestly, it's a little more complex than that. But everything would change if we started history books at, so the first people evolved from this pre-human species in Africa. And then here is what happened to people in Africa. And then like here is where people in Africa went. And here is like what happened to these African people. It almost reminds me kind of like how the Bible is written. Like obviously because the Bible is like the origin story and stuff. Plenty of origin stories in the world, but it talks about the full line of people from the moment Adam and Eve were created to everywhere they went and every son they had and stuff, you know? I guess it would be the Torah or the Old Testament writings. They are unique in a lot of ways compared to other religious texts because they detail all these losses that the Israelites faced and like how they were like condemned constantly and they like were roaming through the desert for 40 years. Like this happens multiple times or something like that. It's just really mind-blowing to think about what a sympathetic narrative toward Africans would look like. Imagine the rise of intellectualism, the rise of humanism, the Enlightenment from the perspective of African people being your subject. The Enlightenment would mean it would be so small and so hypocritical. And of course we can see that from our vantage point now, but like imagine if we had just been taught differently.
this is something where it's like in our last episode we talked about how, like, people want to believe that, like, oh, if you just make like one single policy change, like that'll just fix it, you know. Which, like, obviously, like, you can't just like change one thing and like everything will be fixed. But I do think that, like, if anything would come close, like truly overhauling the way that we like learn about history and engage with history, because it's such a self-perpetuating cycle and self-reinforcing narrative of white supremacy. Because history is like very intrinsically becomes our identity, especially when it comes to like our national identity, or even just like smaller scale community identity is so based in history and our conception of like what our communities are and where they're from.
Yeah, I feel like history doesn't even have to do with the past anymore. Like, definitely, we have entered into an era where history is. Where did I read this? Oh my god. Oh, I was reading Foucault and his writing about like the writing that preceded critiques on Orientalism, where he said truth itself is a source of power. Truth is not an ingredient like washed around, tossed around in power systems, but truth itself is a source of power. And at a certain point in history, I forgot when, stories and narratives, the facts inside them, became not just as simple as like this was the color of this and this is how many sons this person had, but like words came to mean things suspended in time without context. Like words could mean ideas, and words could mean things separated from other things. And so that is when truth and anything that has to do with facts turned competitive. And that's how truth is now. Like, even if we destroyed the way that we talk, like, even if we destroyed mass media, if we destroyed capitalism, like, truth would still be, as we conceive of it, a generator of power. And so I feel like history has obviously fallen down that road as well. Not even history itself, but the telling of history has turned into a generator of power. Like Foucault's idea is that it seems like inappropriate discussing him because James just like thoroughly beats him up in her text, but he's like, even if we got rid of nation, the concept of a nation, truth would still be a generating, like a power generator. A lot of, I feel like, domestic progressivism talks about like how can we reconcile racism and feminism, like then we come up with solutions like intersectional feminism, and like on the flip side like misogynoir, or the concept that different oppressive pressures interact together to create a whole nother oppressive pressure. But like the cool thing, what a stupid word, but like the cool thing about Afrorealism is that it doesn't hold any of those preconceived notions about what feminism is. It acknowledges that like no, feminism came about in this climate which was racist. Like, and in that way feminism isn't this ideal, but it's a concept, it's a moment, it's a movement that is forever what it is, which is embraced by a lot of racist people. And the same thing can be said about, you know, anti-racism work that isn't feminist as well.
That's something with like when it comes to a discussion of like historical figures, historical movements, historical events, and like trying to like you said, like reconcile the good with the bad. It's like sometimes I'm like, you know, like we don't. I mean, we have to acknowledge both. Like we don't have to reconcile one because I feel like often when we discuss this reconciliation between like someone did something good but also did all these bad things, it's like as if we're trying to make them cancel out, or like we're trying to balance a math equation where we're like he did X good things and Y bad things, which equals like was there more X than more Y or vice versa, as if we're trying to find like a net worth, like balancing scales, you know. I'm like, we don't have to do that. Like he did them both. Some sucked, some were good, you know. Obviously that's not literally what people are trying to do, but I don't think it's productive to try and calculate whether or not their like overall net worth was good or bad. I think it's like I try and just sort of break it down and contextualize the rest of their actions.
And I feel like people who see your point there have no choice but to fall into the anti-cancel culture camp because it's like the only one available. But that's also doesn't have to be that way. Like, we can take away power from people who did bad things who aren't necessarily bad, because people don't like usually become 100% evil. Like, that's not really a thing, you know?
Yeah.
But we can still take their power away from them.
Yeah, it's like with cancel culture versus anti-cancel culture. It's either like someone said like something bad or like not politically correct like a decade and a half ago and therefore they should lose everything. Or like it's fine, we should totally forget about the time that guy like said the N-word a year ago. And I'm like, okay, so neither, like, I feel like neither of those are good options. Although I guess I kind of lean more on the side of cancel culture because like we have to hold people responsible for their actions, even if we do so imperfectly. And it's also like in many cases, if someone says or does something like bad, specifically racist, and they like even if they learn like become a better person, etc., like maybe they should be like as tenants like give up their power and have someone who's like better suited like fill that position. I'm speaking specifically about like the Teen Vogue editor in chief. She was like appointed editor in chief. She made some like anti-Asian tweets literally in 2010 or something. One of them was like, "Oh, I woke up with my eyes swollen and I look Asian." I don't know. And then she like they released a statement about it, but then like eventually she ended up stepping down, I think. Okay, I mean like it would be cool if they like hired like and someone Asian instead. I guess I don't know.
I mean, and that always like seems to happen simultaneously with like a step forward, right? But it's really not. It's just that like these bad things are happening all the time. Races are being exposed all the time. Is that the youngest Vogue editor ever just became the editor of Vogue China? She's like 26. I think Vogue should have maintained consistency there.
Whoever they appoint next, like I'm sure if you dig deep enough, there's probably gonna be something bad that they did too. So that's also like I feel like a key thing here is like the time that we became adults and the way that our childhood and past mistakes were documented on the internet. Like very few of my past poor decisions and prejudices are documented on the internet. I don't think any of them are, thank God, because the person who I was in middle school is not good.
Yeah, that reminds me of a reading. It was like The Right to Be Forgotten.
Yeah,
Like we didn't consent to have our histories documented on social media. We did not consent to that when we pressed accept on terms and conditions. I don't want to get into that because
that's a whole new can of worms.
yeah. But what you're saying reminds me, it feels ridiculous to me to be pro cancel culture or anti cancel culture because I always think of like how great at collective action a lot of East Asian countries are, and I only know about this because I am East Asian, right? Like there's plenty of history of great collective action throughout the world. I just like know about the East Asian ones. Cancel culture evokes for me, or it did evoke for me, that idea of like collective action. Like everyone is like, oh, that's bad, and then they're like, okay, we said it's bad now, so that person can go to hell. Like I love that. Part of the reason why cancel culture is so powerful in Asia is definitely it draws from this like tradition of collective action and like this almost entitlement in like the best way possible to things being right. And that is rooted, unfortunately, in this like cultural conservatism and asceticism, the type that Dr. Sabrina Strings is talking about. It's unfortunate, but church is great at collective action, or were great at collective action. A lot of conservative groups great at collective action because they all really believe that they deserve to say what's right and wrong. And yeah, so I can completely understand that like cancel culture is not collective action, like it's not organized in any sense whatsoever. But I still like that people can be like, yeah, that's not okay with me. I'm not going to give my money to them anymore. Like that should be completely acceptable.
It's like, yeah, like I agree with it. Like oftentimes I see people like called out or something for something. I'm like, yeah, that's pretty bad. Like you should have known better not to do it. So like I'm gonna like avoid funding you in any way, or whatever. But sometimes I'm like, you know what? Like I don't. Why am I reading all these tweets about this? Like I just they need to figure their own shit out. Like
Yeah. I was listening to a podcast where the hosts were talking about how they haven't yet had to give up something that meant a lot to them before. Like they were talking about Michael Jackson and how like yes, they like listened to his music all the time and stuff, but it wasn't as emotional of a connection as it could have been. So they could like definitely go through their Spotify and learn like all the Michael Jackson stuff. And they can like stop watching like Woody Allen films even though they were beautiful, partly because they've already seen them, and they can like remember like the valuable parts and just like outwardly be like, yeah, I'm never watching one of his films again or whatever. But The Bachelor is being canceled. Like, not canceled off TV, but it's like like clearly there's a lot of issues with The Bachelor and it just keeps getting louder and louder, and they're like, but I watched The Bachelor like so much. They're like, I watch every episode, and they're like, yeah, I think like this has finally become this stupid little thing that like it will be really painful to cut out of my life. But they were like, but I think we have to do it.
I feel like The Bachelor was like invented to be a problem. Like that's the whole point. Is that it's a problem in every way conceivable.
It's incredibly conservative and raunchy at the same time. Like, I don't know if it's me, like, not having been grown up as steeped in like Western hypocrisies as I could have been, because I like never watched like Western TV and stuff while I was like growing up. But like stuff like The Bachelor or even music that's like they don't say sex, they don't say anything explicit, but it's like clearly sexual. I'm like, is this allowed? Because to me it's about like the real situation. The Bachelor or The Bachelorette is having sex with multiple people night after night. And everyone knows.
Well, okay, they don't have sex.
Like, what the
They just make out.
No, they sometimes have sex.
It's true. There was one.
They have a room.
The girl
they
Hannah. I only know
be.
this because I watched like half a season with my friends in college. But like, she had sex with some of them, and then she like made a whole statement where she's like, "I am like, I'm like religious and like I love God, but like I love my body and like I will like celebrate myself." Like, it was like a whole thing. I was like, oh, I don't know. That's something for like. Obviously, I'm aware that like purity culture exists, but sometimes I forget about it for a bit because it's not in my head, you know.
Yeah. When I think about it now, like in middle school, like I really believe that like people were waiting till marriage. And now if I like if I think about like older couples, meaning like couples in their 20s that I knew when I was in middle school and like we were all like church people and stuff, sure, like maybe some of them did wait till marriage. Like I'm willing to believe that just because I personally know them. But like they were having sex. Like to me, this is like the equivalent of someone telling me Santa Claus isn't real. I'm like, oh my god, they were doing it.
It's like when people, I mean, it's not often. If someone like tries to use like slut or like whore as an insult, I'm just like,
I'm
what?
like, what are you talking about?
I'm like, I'm getting laid. It's, I'm like, that's so bizarre. Like, what?
And it's weird because like I'm still immersed in my own ways. I'm sure a lot of people are, but I forget, right? Because I don't have like white Trumpist relatives, so but I forget that like, oh, church is a conservative place. Like, oh, my family in Korea is a conservative place. Sometimes I'll forget and I almost say shit and I'm like that kind of does come back to the friends conversation because like I have true genuine friends, or when I was before COVID like going to church a lot more regularly, right? Like I had true genuine friends who like were fully conservative, anti-LGBTQ. Like I thought we were friends, you know? But like the more I think about it, they weren't hateful people. They would never demonstrate or whatever. Like it's like they understand like that's definitely not how like that's not their calling. That's not their divine calling whatsoever. That's ridiculous. But at the same time, they truly hold these sentiments, you know? And still I felt close to them. And thinking about that from a detached point of view is so bizarre because even at that point, right, I thought of myself as somebody who had only like friends whose politics I respected. I am often made uncomfortable when my friends reveal themselves to hold like values that I don't respect. So what was happening there? What was it, dissonance, or like was it bad even?
I'm torn between like, I want to actively be like friends with people with a myriad of viewpoints because I think a lot about whether or not I'm backing myself into a little echo chamber. How I like, in terms of like challenging my own framework and not allowing myself to simply hear what I want to hear. And also for the opportunity to hopefully like connect with people and maybe enable them to like see my point of view. But also at the same time, I'm like, who has the time or the energy for that?
Honestly, who has the time or energy both ways? Like friends are so few and far in between.
What that brings me back to is Bell Hooks. She, in her writing, she quoted Paulo Freire. I'm not sure how to say his name, but he says, authentic help means that all who are involved help each other mutually, growing together in the common effort to understand the reality which they seek to transform. And I feel like that's something that resonated with me and like feels relevant to our discussion of friends in terms of like, is it a mutual attempt and like a mutual work together?
Yeah, again, that's interesting because Tuck and Yang's Decolonization is not a metaphor explicitly critiques Freire and his pedagogy, because they're basically like, it's not about neutrality. Like, things have been one way for so long that even if they shifted 180 degrees in the opposite direction, we could not remedy how much pain and how much destabilization and displacement that has occurred. Like, we will never know what like a better world, or a world that just belonged to Native people or belonged to Africans, would have looked like. Thank you for listening. This was Roses All Trash. This was the second episode of the April calendar for Read Community. Our theme for this month is Decolonization is not a metaphor. I'm Ryan.
I'm Catherine.
And you can follow our socials at Roses All Trash, or you can follow me at RRRYEN, and Catherine at Catherine.shark. See you next week.
Bye.